This place is great, really comfortable. I'm just gonna get settled in.
What makes a story? Who better to answer this question than one of the great philosophers, Aristotle? His take on this narrative concept is that any story must have a beginning where a problem emerges, a middle where we see the characters struggle to solve the problem, and lastly an end where the problem is finally resolved. In this modern age, as society becomes increasingly digitized, so is the way in which the public consumes narrative-based content, with the rise of streaming services such as Netflix, and more movies being shot and produced using digital formats. More recently, this also includes video games. Now, how does narrative and storytelling work in video games? Let's go through a few of the linear-based narrative structures, and starting with the most familiar, the linear model. It is the most familiar because it is the narrative structure that is almost only utilized by the other popular medium forms of film and literature. And while there are the odd exceptions every now and again with the likes of the Choose Your Own Adventure children's books and Black Mirror Bandersnatch, where the reader or viewer can determine what happens next, they are few and far between because of how rare and oftentimes difficult it is for the aforementioned media to integrate some system of audience interaction, let alone have the progression of the story be responsively dependent on such. Linear narratives advance the story as the name suggests, in a single, straight path. No deviations, no backtracking, no skipping. A defined beginning, middle, end in that exact order, akin to the Aristotle definition. In video games, this translates to players simply being along for the ride, withheld from any choices that can affect the story, and without any power to alter it through gameplay.
So, you want to hear another story, huh? One where the very fate of Pandora hangs in the balance. If not, too bad, I'm telling you anyway.
From this, we then move on to what is referred in game design as the string of pearls model, where the story is told in linear fashion, but can be interrupted by player freedom at times. These interruptions often come in the form of optional side quests distributed throughout the game world that work to complement the sequence of missions related to the main storyline. It is this aspect of exploration that makes this narrative model almost entirely unique in video games, by how it's able to place the audience in the action of the story like none other before its time through the combination of cinematography and music. And so with games that take on linear narratives closely mirroring the storytelling style of films, the main benefit and appeal of these type of games is that they provide for the most cinematic experience where not only are you the protagonist, but you also have limited directorial control of certain scenes. Which scenes, however, is where we come across our first quote-unquote con, because they're effectively the ones, while entertaining, mainly act as filler. To give an analogy, these are the scenes in an 80s action movie where you as the hero is simply just mowing down expendable henchmen by the hundreds, whereas scenes that work to progress the plot often bring the player back to the role of the observer in the form of cutscenes. From stories merely being included to provide context to the gameplay, to games nowadays being vehicles for storytelling and in many cases even having the gameplay take a back seat, as seen by the emergence of walking simulators and episodic decision-based titles. The following downside is that purely linear narratives are seemingly slowly disappearing in the industry as players seek more meaningful experiences. How so? In being able to make choices that actually matter.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left. This was not the correct way to the meeting room, and Stanley knew it perfectly well. Perhaps he wanted to stop by the employee lounge first, just to admire it.
In the evolution of video game technology, so grew the significance of choice in video game stories and the potential for video game narratives as a whole. As time went on, simple choices like whether to run or jump eventually became character-driven moral dilemmas. Video games were expanding, pixels turned into polygons, and the opportunities of interaction provided to users meant video game storytelling was becoming more engaging than ever. More and more, video games became an avenue for not only fun interactive entertainment, but also endless stories to be told by writers and developers who saw the narrative potential in video games. How video games differentiate themselves from other media narratives is in the role of the player. As Lawrence discussed in Part 1, in video games today, players are often granted varying degrees of influence and control over their own experience. However, non-linear video games offer a far wider degree of freedom to users, as much of the appeal of these non-linear games is built on the expectation of player choice. But what form does this player choice take? And to what degree do non-linear games typically provide player agency? While a truly non-linear game would be driven entirely by player choice, most non-linear games of today feature narratives comprised of predefined choices presented to the player.
That's not so bad.
This allows players to express agency within video game narratives, while still allowing a coherent and written story to be told. While you can't choose to do literally anything you want within these virtual worlds, this doesn't mean every game needs that level of freedom. While procedurally generated games like the recent AI Dungeon can offer users boundless freedom of choice, they also suffer from a lack of compelling narrative, whereas most non-linear role-playing games try to more effectively balance agency and narrative by offering limited but impactful player choice. In video games, player agency comes in many forms, whether it be character dialogue or implicit choices in the form of actions taken by the player. These are decisions both big and small that can have an impact on the story, as well as the experience of the game overall. I believe the Fallout series of games are a great example of video games offering impactful player choice, as not only are they known for their typically sharp writing, but the player is given a large degree of freedom to impact the world and narrative how they wish. In the world of New Vegas, multiple different factions are vying for control of a post-apocalyptic southwestern America. Each of these factions are vastly different from one another concerning their goals, morals, and leadership. The player is completely free to explore the Mojave Wasteland however they wish, having created a character whose motives and actions are entirely up to the player. New Vegas is a game heavily driven by character conversation, and in these interactions is where much of the player's agency resides. This structure of narrative agency through dialogue choice is common throughout many non-linear games, as it allows developers to craft a fluid yet consistent narrative that responds to the choices selected by the player.
From where you're kneeling must seem like an 18-carat run of bad luck. Truth is, the game was rigged from the start.
Now listen carefully, this is important. Stanley walked through the red door.
Another example of non-linear games would be those influenced by player action as opposed to direct dialogue choices. An example being the Stanley Parable, which is a non-linear game that responds to the actions taken by the player rather than the explicit decisions typically found in dialogue menus.
Aha, perhaps you misunderstood. Stanley walked through the red door.
Experiences like these are less common, but supremely engaging when done right due to their high degree of interactivity. The game, or in this case the narrator, responds seamlessly to the actions taken by the player.
No!
In summary, all of the factors discussed is what led to non-linear gaming experiences growing exponentially in popularity over the last 2 decades. However, another factor is how evolving hardware and technology has allowed these choice-driven experiences, and video game narratives in general, to flourish as the characters and environments within these games have been able to be realized with a higher degree of fidelity than ever before.
From the cinematic tradition of storytelling that spurred in the early 20th century, the importance of setting an environment through visuals and audio also continued. Auditory enhancements such as sound design and musical scores for video games help set the ambiance and create a more cohesive presentation of the story to the player by setting the proper tone either in the company of dialogue or in the absence of dialogue. Notable examples include the Legend of Zelda franchise and the Halo series. Video game graphics have progressed at a rapid rate within the last few decades. Properly utilized visuals can create a more intimate connection between the player and the game. As a result, interactions by the player can be driven by the feelings conveyed by the characters and how in turn it influences the player. And because technology now is not as big of a limiting factor when developing video games, more complex graphics can result in potentially elevated storytelling capabilities. An example of this includes the game Detroit Become Human, where the choices made by the player are highly influenced by the relationships and the dilemmas that arise because of the setting, character, and plot. all of which are further enhanced by the photorealistic graphics that contribute to the believability and attachment to the game. These interactions and choices made by the player influence the ending that the player will receive, giving the interactions more importance than before. Whether it is choosing to steal from a convenience store to shooting another character, the players have the option to either take action or to stand by. Photorealistic games like these aim to make the story more convincing to the player when used properly, by aiding the player's immersion into the game's world. Advanced graphics are not always the most important thing in effectively communicating a story. Above all, the graphics should be critically and purposefully chosen to enhance the story and game. That is to say, simple graphics, if used properly, can still achieve the desired connection between the player and the game. A great example of this is The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. At the time, the GameCube's technological limits were not advanced enough to develop the open exploration aspect with the same detail given to other games. How it made up for this was by using a cartoony art style to make up for the technical shortcomings. For example, water did not have to behave how real water behaves, it simply had to behave in the way cartoon water is expected to behave. What this allowed for was an interactive story based on open exploration of the world that did not sacrifice its story and game mechanics for appealing graphics. This is a great art design because the graphics can still hold up to today, and the story still made sense in the art style given. That is to say, the art style managed to enhance the story being presented. It's fun and inviting, and it captures the player's eye and interest in the game. Above all, it is still able to achieve its goals of creating a unique experience for the player in their journey through the game's world through the sailing mechanic. Video games allow for a more tailored and unique form of storytelling when combining interactivity with the game's visuals. Okami is a game that's art design is integrated extremely well with the main gameplay loop. It uses traditional Japanese art styles to both capture the story's folklore essence while also using art, specifically painting and calligraphy, as an in-game mechanism, such as for fighting enemies or for building and altering the game's world. This works because it is not photorealistic and because the game is so stylized. And that's good art design because it makes sense in the game's world and for the interactive parts. In addition, the player's progress is illustrated through the game's art. When the main character runs, flowers bloom in a trail behind her, promoting the player to explore further by making it visually appealing. And when foes are defeated, the setting transforms from darkness back to a rejuvenated landscape, rewarding the player for their achievements. Art is what helps deliver the story, and it is just as integral to the interactive storytelling experience as it is to the cinematic experience.
How can VR help us tell better stories? Storytelling has existed for millennia and has been the vehicle for propagating history, traditions, values, tales of morality, and entertainment. A key element to the effectiveness of storytelling is empathy. Being drawn into putting oneself into the place of another and understanding someone's feelings by identifying with them has always led to a better appreciation of the story. There are two forms of empathy. State empathy, where the experience of emotional empathetic moments is in response to another individual's feelings, and trait empathy, which is an individual's tendency to feel empathetic towards others' experiences in general. Film has been effectively evoking emotions through empathy for decades, and generally only seems to be getting better at it. Take the example of the scene playing in the background from the film Interstellar. The emotional cues from the actors and the music were masterfully crafted to target the state empathy of the audience. When I first saw this, there was audible sobbing throughout the theater as the audience experienced the relief, grief, and regret of Cooper. The next step in evocative and empathetic storytelling would seem to be virtual reality environments in which the audience can observe, interact with, and potentially alter the story. Video games are a media perfectly suited to this type of storytelling. With its uniquely immersive nature, convincing virtual reality has been a moving target for the video game industry since the mid-20th century. Originally explored in the mid-20th century as a method of viewing cinema, VR has evolved to its modern-day form based on a paper from 1965 by Ivan Sutherland titled The Ultimate Display, which defined the metrics by which a VR display could be considered to have achieved the perception of perfect virtual reality. Studies have shown that VR creates a physical perception and reaction to VR. Subjects reported a sense of physically entering the VR environment and orienting themselves in that space in a manner that can be detected by electroencephalogram scans. A 2018 paper by E. Bang and C. Yildirim showed that using VR simply to show their subjects documentary footage designed to provoke empathy had little to no success in doing so. This was likely due to the primarily passive nature of watching a video despite being immersed in it. There are two games which have implemented VR more successfully than any games previously in both game mechanics and driving the narrative, and these are Half-Life Alyx and Defector. Players of these games reported that they feel present in a fashion previously unexperienced, with a sense of scale and immersion which is unparalleled. With effective game design and writing, players have reported a sense of apprehension, fear, and abject terror which traditionally presented horror games fall far short of, despite neither of these games being wholly of that genre. Both games allow for unprecedented free movement within their environments and the need to explore vastly more involved and interactive environments to find elements of the narrative to progress in the game. A major challenge to future implementation of VR for compelling and emotional narrative is how the developers can evoke such empathy without being constrained to scripted cutscenes. Should this hurdle be jumped, imagine the use of such immersive experiences to teach and preserve history and the appreciation for the sacrifice of those who died, were injured, or traumatized in war, rather than the glorification of war in games like Call of Duty. Imagine how heart-wrenching emotional experiences from games like The Last of Us, Telltale Games The Walking Dead, or Shadow of the Colossus could further be amplified through the creative use of VR. I know that I'm ready for games to bring me to the point of ugly crying like Interstellar did.